Hi, I'm Nick Yu, and my podcast is on Chinese exclusion. My research question is, how did the period of exclusion of Chinese immigrants prompted by factors such as Californian hostility and the Exclusion Act of 1882 impact their communities in California? Um, so the motives of the Exclusion Act included those who opposed it and those who advocated for it. The Chinese initially arrived 30 years before the passing of the Exclusion Act in search of gold. And basically one of the reasons why it took so long for them to pass the Exclusion Act was because many people actually opposed it, such as mine owners in places with labor shortages. The Chinese were viewed as low wage efficient labor, and because of this, they were highly sought after as workers. And many people just believed it was pure racism, but they were just on the smaller side of the population. Those who advocated for it as said it was their quote duty and sovereign right as Californians and Americans to do so for the good of the country. That's a quote from Erica Lee. Many miners who wanted to capitalize on the gold rush opposed it because the Chinese were taking their jobs as they worked for less money and worked harder. Exclusion was also put into place due to the poor labor market conditions, and because new Chinese companies began to compete with white-owned firms, many thought it was becoming a problem and a threat. White Americans dreaded that Chinese had the capacity to do all sorts of work and claimed the Chinese didn't suffer from heat because they are nevertheless unimpassioned animals. And that's a quote from William Way, which was in our class readings. Californian lawyers also began to testify, trying to approve the passing of the Exclusion Act. They portrayed Chinese immigration as an evil, unarmed invasion. And many committees started to investigate the effects that Chinese immigration had on the economy and society. There are also those who just had white settler ideals. Immigration control was emerging as a key pillar, securing settler dominance. And that quote is from Hernandez, which was also in our class readings. My first primary source, if it'll go, is this political cartoon, which shows how Americans perceive Chinese as threats. And basically, it depicts a Chinaman that was barred out of the Golden Gate of Liberty. He sits next to a sign that lists out certain enemies of democracy. And the irony behind this is that the gate is that California during the gold rush was viewed as an entryway to liberty and opportunity, and yet the Chinamen were locked out. Another ironic part of this is when the sign says the US is welcome to communists, socialists, hoodlums, etc., yet it's not welcome to Chinamen. And basically the purpose of the cartoon is to show that Americans viewed Chinamen as a bigger threat to America than their actual enemies, which were people that rivaled democracy and could potentially harm their country. It also displayed blatant racism. The passing of the Exclusion Act and what it entailed was basically 10 years of exclusion for Chinese people, and it kind of set off a chain reaction of other policies such as the Geary Act and the 1902 Act. It was the first piece of legislation in the history of the US to deny the entry of certain groups of people based on their race. I thought that was a cool fact. And it relates to racism and discrimination because it went against the ideals of liberty and also denied the Chinese people rights. And the Chinese became subject to hostility and used as scapegoats. My second primary source is extracted specifically from the Exclusion Act and the legal documentation. It shows the extent of the government, or it shows that the extent of the government went to in order to keep the Chinese out, and also the blatant racism of those in power. In the document, the government claims that, quote, the coming of the Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good of certain localities within the territory. And this kind of shows that even those in the highest position of power felt the Chinese were a threat to their country. They also made it clear that any boat or vessel carrying Chinese, quote, shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor and on conviction thereof shall be punished by a fine of not more than $500 for each and every Chinese laborer so brought, and may also be imprisoned for a term not exceeding 1 year. This was meant to deter any help towards the Chinese and would completely isolate them from the whites. The geographical effects on Chinese immigrants in the West were that many moved to San Francisco and Los Angeles during the era of exclusion. In these two cities, they formed communities called Chinatowns. And the San Francisco Chinatown was much bigger than the LA Chinatown, as the San Francisco Chinatown had around 12,000 Chinese, which was around 8% of the total city population. The one in LA was very small, and it only had around 605 Chinese in the early stages of exclusion, but it quickly grew to around 2,111 in 1900. But that was still less than 2% of the total city population. They became self-sufficient communities and lived in isolation away from whites. They didn't really interact with much of the rest of society. They developed Chinese traditions of their culture and businesses and showed the strength and resilience that the Chinese wanted to show off to the whites as they kind of banded together against their oppressors. In both Chinatowns, they shared close commercial and cultural ties due to the exclusion period, and during a time when many Chinese communities in the West were declining due to the Exclusion Act. They were able to buy and trade exclusively within their communities, and it kind of benefited them in a way that they were able to stay outside of the fragile economies of LA and San Francisco. Some of the social effects on these Chinese immigrant communities in the West were that there's a low female population in Chinese communities due to policies. Mostly Chinese laborers that were allowed or wanted mostly Chinese laborers that were allowed or wanted in America, were male. Due to this and complicated documentation processes, many women were needed at their households back in China or turned away from China to enter the US. It led to a serious gender imbalance and a lack of families among Chinatowns in the West. These male-dominated communities led to an increase in volumes of problems such as gambling, prostitution, and isolation. It also kind of created a racial stereotype that the Chinese were degraded and that they were disgusting and barbaric for being able to tolerate poor living conditions. It led Americans to think that the Chinese were in the US only to siphon off of the wealth of their country. And this affected the view of whites who use these stereotypes as motivations to exclude the Chinese from their country and as motivations for acts of violence. It served as a way to constrict Chinese population as it indirectly slowed the reproduction of Chinese families in the US. The effects of a low female population persisted into the mid to late 1900s, which I also thought was cool as it kind of relates to more of a present time. Chinese elites were groups of Chinese people, usually doctors and merchants, and they received different treatment from whites. It kind of showed that there was a class bias as it gave exemptions to certain elite groups. And these elites were a large part of the economy and society, both inside and outside Chinatowns due to their status. Here's a quote from Kenneth Marcus and Chen Yang. And it says that Chinese elites in California had greater abilities and opportunities than the common laborer to cross racial, geographic, and even gender boundaries at a time when segregation, discrimination, and race hatred remained the norm in relations between Asians and European Americans. And so basically, like, the Chinese elites held positions of leadership in not only their Chinatowns, but also outside of them. And this displayed the power of social and economic status during the time of exclusion. The last thing I want to talk about is the Geary Act of 1892. It was caused by the domino effect of the Chinese exclusion. And so when the Exclusion Act ended, the Geary Act was put into place. And we learned about this in chapter 3 of Hernandez's Not Imprisonment in a Legal Sense. It required that Chinese carry a permit that proved residency, or they could face deportation. But many whites and Chinese initially together fought the deportation and against the government's legal rights. And due to the tensions it created with China and its poor funding, it wasn't as enforced as other acts. China actually even threatened to cut off like economic ties with the US. Anti-Chinese citizen committees were formed due to the poor enforcement, and fury over non-enforcement caused residents to unleash deportation raids in LA. And many whites in LA tried to purge the city of Chinese people, and I just thought it was cool to add that because with our school being in LA, all of this happened right here. Overall, Chinese exclusion was greatly enforced by whites, and it affected Chinese communities in economic and social ways. And that's the end of my podcast. Thank you for listening.